Chapter 1. The Island is Clear. Date: June 15th, 1944, 05:45 a.m. Location: Mariana Islands, Sector, Blue Beach, Saipan. The Leviathans of the Deep. The invasion of Saipan did not begin on the shore. It began in the minds of the planners months prior and manifested in the staggering assembly of steel that now choked the horizon. As the first gray light of dawn touched the Pacific, it revealed a fleet of unprecedented proportions. Task Force 58 had arrived. At the center of this naval armada were the old battleships, the Tennessee, the California, and the Maryland. These were vessels that had been raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, rebuilt with a vengeance, and now served as the ultimate instruments of American industrial might. Their main batteries, massive 14-inch guns, were trained on the green slopes of Saipan. When the order to fire was given, the world seemed to tilt. The concussive force of the broadsides sent ripples across the surface of the ocean for miles. Each shell, weighing as much as a small car, screamed through the atmosphere with a sound often described by the men as a freight train hurtling through the sky. The objective was simple: to erase the Japanese coastal defenses, to turn the coral bunkers into dust, and to pave a path of fire for the coming infantry. From the decks of the massive transport ships, thousands of men watched the spectacle. For the Marines of the 2nd and 4th Divisions, the bombardment was a double-edged sword. It provided a sense of overwhelming security, yet it served as a terrifying reminder of what awaited them. They were the old breed, and the new recruits alike, huddled together in the LCVP, landing craft, vehicle, personnel, Higgins boats, waiting for the signal to lower the davits and begin the long, nauseating circle toward the line of departure. The descent into the void. Inside one of these plywood and steel boxes was First Sergeant Daniel Mackenzie. He stood at the rear, near the roaring diesel engine, his eyes fixed on the backs of his men. The air was thick with the smell of unburned fuel, salt spray, and the metallic tang of weapon grease. There was no conversation. The roar of the engine and the thunder of the distant naval guns made speech nearly impossible, but the silence was more than acoustic, it was psychological. The Marines were weighted down with 60 pounds of gear, M1 Garand rifles, bandoliers of ammunition, grenades, bayonets, entrenching tools, and canteens. Every man was a walking arsenal, yet in the face of the Pacific, they felt small. They remembered the stories of Tarawa, the bloody Tarawa, where the water turned red and the reef was littered with the bodies of men who never made it to the sand. They expected Saipan to be worse. Intelligence had warned of a Gibraltar of the Pacific, an island where every cave was a pillbox and every palm tree hid a sniper. As the boat hit the surf zone, the world became a blur of white water and gray smoke. The Higgins boat bucked like a wild animal as it crossed the coral reef. Mackenzie gripped the side rail, his knuckles white, his jaw set. He waited for the impact, the sudden jolt of a shell, the ping of a sniper's bullet against the steel ramp. He waited for the screams. But as the boat grounded itself on the soft sand of Blue Beach, the expected cacophony of defensive fire never came. The ghostly shore. The ramp fell with a heavy, mechanical thud, splashing into the shallow water. Mackenzie was the first out, his boots hitting the warm Pacific surf. He charged forward, rifle at the high port, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He ran 20 yards, then 40, then 60, finally throwing himself behind a jagged piece of coral. He scanned the tree line through his sights, his finger trembling slightly on the trigger. The beach was a graveyard of trees, but not of men. The naval bombardment had been thorough, the palms were decapitated, the sand was scorched, and the smell of sulfur hung heavy in the humid air. But there was no return fire. No Nambu machine guns stuttered from the heights. No mortars rained down on the arriving waves. One by one, the men of his platoon reached the sand. They moved with the frantic energy of those who expected to die, but as the minutes passed, and the only sound remained the distant rumble of the fleet, A strange, uneasy calm began to settle over the beachhead. The Blue Beach sector, which was supposed to be a killing zone, was as quiet as a Sunday morning in a cemetery. The architecture of deception. By mid-morning, the logistical miracle of the U.S. military was in full swing. The beach, once a pristine strip of white sand, was now a chaotic hub of activity. Massive LSTs, landing ship tanks, had groaned onto the shore, their alligator muzzles opening to vomit out Sherman tanks and M3 half-tracks. Thousands of crates of sea rations, mountains of ammunition boxes, and miles of communication wire were being stacked under the scorching sun. Staff officers from the division headquarters walked the beach with clipboards, their uniforms barely stained with sweat. The reports coming in from all sectors, red, green, and blue, were identical. No organized resistance encountered. Enemy positions abandoned. Beachhead secure. The aerial observers, flying low in their O-36-style spotter planes, reported seeing columns of Japanese soldiers retreating into the dense, mountainous interior toward Mount Tapachau. The conclusion reached by the High Command was swift and unanimous. The 3 days of preparatory naval fire had worked. The Japanese garrison, estimated at 30,000, had been broken. It was believed that the survivors had fled in terror, abandoning their coastal artillery and fixed fortifications to seek refuge in the caves of the north. The order was given to push inland. The cautious, phase-by-phase plan was discarded in favor of a rapid advance to seize the vital Aslito airfield. The silence of the jungle. Mackenzie led his patrol into the first fringe of the jungle, moving off the sand and into the deep, suffocating shade of the tropical canopy. The transition was jarring. The bright, open glare of the beach was replaced by a claustrophobic world of tangled banyan roots and rotting vegetation. They found the Japanese trenches. They were masterpieces of engineering, reinforced with coconut logs and coral rock, positioned to sweep the beach with interlocking fire. But they were empty. As Mackenzie jumped into one of the pits, he found it scrupulously clean. There were no spent brass casings, no bloodstains, no abandoned equipment. It didn't look like a position that had been suppressed by fire. It looked like a position that had been vacated by choice. The Marines around him began to relax. The terror of the morning was replaced by a cocky, swaggering confidence. They began to talk about how the Japs couldn't handle the big guns, how they had run for the hills at the first sight of the American flag. Helmets were pushed back, cigarettes were lit, and the disciplined spacing of the march began to wither as the men bunched up, sharing jokes and stories. But Mackenzie felt a cold weight in the pit of his stomach. He noticed the birds, or rather, the lack of them. In the jungles of the Solomon Islands, the forest was never quiet. It was a constant riot of squawks, chatters, and the hum of a trillion insects. Here, on Saipan, the jungle was mute. It was as if the island itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He looked at the ground and saw very few footprints leading away. For an army of 30,000 to retreat, they would have left a trail of destruction, discarded packs, trampled brush, the filth of a panicked flight. Instead, the jungle floor was undisturbed. As the sun reached its zenith, the official word came down the line via the SCR-300 backpack radios. The island is clear. Proceed to Phase 2. High speed, no delay. The American army, buoyed by the illusion of an easy victory, began its march into the heart of Saipan. They walked with their rifles slung, their hearts light, and their eyes focused on the horizon. They were walking into the most sophisticated trap ever laid in the history of the Pacific War. Beneath their feet, in a hidden network of limestone tunnels and volcanic vents that stretched for miles, the Japanese 43rd Division sat in absolute darkness, their hands on the triggers, listening to the rhythmic thud of 10,000 American boots. The island was not clear. The island was a trigger, and the Americans had just stepped on it. The heavy air of the interior. By early afternoon, the humidity of Saipan had become a physical weight. The Blue Beach headrest was now 2 miles behind them, a distant memory of white sand and salt air. For the men of the 2nd Marine Division, the interior of the island was a claustrophobic maze of sugarcane fields and jagged limestone ridges. The confidence of the morning march had begun to curdle into a dull, grinding exhaustion. The official word remained unchanged. The enemy had retreated. The island was clear. First Sergeant Daniel Mackenzie wiped the stinging sweat from his eyes with a grime-caked sleeve. His platoon was moving in a long, staggered column through a natural depression, a draw surrounded by steep, rocky slopes. The vegetation here was dense, a mix of scrub brush and ancient, twisted trees with roots that clung to the volcanic rock like skeletal fingers. The heat was stagnant, trapped in the valley, smelling of damp earth and the sickly sweet scent of overripe fruit. The Marines were spread out, but not enough. The lack of resistance had bred a dangerous casualness. Men walked with their rifles slung over their shoulders. Some had even unbuttoned their heavy HBT jackets to catch a stray breeze that never came. The rhythmic thud of their boots on the dry earth was the only sound in the valley. The silence that Mackenzie had noted in the morning had followed them here, deepening, becoming more ominous with every yard they gained toward the heights of Mount Tapochow. The shattering of the silence. The transition from peace to war did not happen with a warning. It happened with a single, sharp crack that echoed off the limestone walls. It was the distinct sound of an Arisaka rifle, a high-velocity 6.5mm round. In the center of the column, a young Marine, barely 20 years old, suddenly jerked as if an invisible wire had yanked him from above. The bullet struck the center of his chest, passing through his lungs and exiting his back in a spray of crimson that painted the green leaves behind him. He didn't even have time to scream. He simply collapsed into the dust, his helmet clattering against the stones. For a heartbeat, the column froze in collective disbelief. The brain, conditioned by hours of being told the island was clear, struggled to process the reality of a lethal shot. Then, the world exploded. From the slopes above, from the roots of the trees, and from the very ground beneath their feet, a hellish symphony of fire erupted. The Japanese had not retreated to the mountains. They had become part of the mountain. Hidden apertures, no larger than a man's head and perfectly camouflaged with natural vegetation and coral dust, opened simultaneously. These were not mere foxholes. They were the pillboxes of the earth, connected to a vast, subterranean hive that intelligence had completely failed to map. The killing ground. The Japanese Type 99 machine guns, known for their high rate of fire that sounded like tearing silk, began to rip through the American ranks. The Marines were caught in a classic L-shaped ambush. Crossfire from the ridges turned the valley floor into a meat grinder. Mackenzie dove for cover behind a low limestone shelf, the air above him buzzing with the snap hiss of passing rounds. He watched in horror as the orderly column disintegrated. Men were being hit from 3 sides at once. There was no front line to charge, no visible enemy to fire back at. The clear island had revealed its true face, a giant, multi-layered fortress where every rock was a potential gun port. The Japanese deep defense doctrine, mastered by General Saito, was on full display. They had allowed the Americans to bypass their forward observers, letting the heavy armor and command elements pass through, only to slam the door shut on the infantry support. The Marines were trapped in the kill zone of a pre-registered artillery box. Within seconds of the first rifle shot, Japanese mortars, the dreaded knee mortars, began to walk their rounds up and down the valley floor with terrifying precision. The enemy beneath. The most terrifying aspect was the proximity of the enemy. As Mackenzie tried to rally his squad, he saw a section of the ground, a patch of grass he would have sworn was solid earth, suddenly lift. A Japanese soldier, draped in a grass-weave camouflage cape, emerged from a hidden tunnel entrance only 10 feet away. The soldier didn't charge with a bayonet. He calmly tossed a ceramic grenade into a group of Marines huddling behind a dead palm, and disappeared back into the earth before a single shot could be fired in return. The grenades on Saipan were different. Crude, ceramic spheres that shattered into thousands of razor-sharp shards. The explosions were small but lethal, filling the air with the screams of the wounded. The Marines were fighting ghosts. They would fire a fusillade at a muzzle flash in the brush, only for the fire to cease and erupt from a completely different direction 30 seconds later. The subterranean network allowed the Japanese to move squads under the very feet of the Americans. One moment, a sector was considered cleared. The next, a machine gun team would pop up in the rear, cutting down the medics and radio operators. The coordination was surgical. The radio in Mackenzie's unit was shattered by a sniper's bullet within the first minute of the engagement, severing their link to the heavy artillery on the beach. They were alone in the dark green heart of a trap. The realization of the grave. By 3 p.m., the valley was choked with the acrid smoke of cordite and the smell of blood. The Marines had managed to form small, desperate pockets of resistance, huddling in craters or behind the few tanks that had managed to turn around. But the tanks were nearly blind in the dense terrain. Japanese spider hole occupants would wait for a tank to pass, then leap out with satchel charges or magnetic mines, disabling the steel giants and leaving the infantry without their only shield. Mackenzie, pinned down and watching his ammunition dwindle, realized the magnitude of the disaster. The entire first wave of the invasion was being bled white because they had believed their own propaganda. They had walked into a house where the walls were made of guns. Every time a Marine tried to move forward to retrieve a fallen comrade, a sniper's bullet would find him. The Japanese were not trying to drive them back to the sea. They were trying to annihilate them where they stood. The plateau was no longer a tactical objective. It was a slaughterhouse. The clear island had become a nightmare of limestone and lead. The Marines were no longer the hunters. They were the prey, caught in a cage of tropical greenery and volcanic rock. As the sun began to dip behind the ridges, casting long, skeletal shadows across the valley of death, the true nature of the battle for Saipan became clear. It wouldn't be a 2-day march. It would be a descent into a new kind of hell, a war where the earth itself was the enemy. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had begun to grind. And as the screams of the wounded echoed through the silent, indifferent trees, Daniel Mackenzie knew that the survival of his men depended on discarding everything they had been told and learning to fight a ghost in its own grave. The dawn of resolution. The first night on the plateau had been a waking nightmare of infiltration and knee mortar barrages, but as the sun rose over the jagged spine of Mount Tapochau on the second day, the atmosphere among the survivors of the 2nd Marine Division had undergone a fundamental shift. The wide-eyed shock of the initial ambush had hardened into a cold, calcified rage. The illusion of an empty island was dead, buried under the bodies of the men who had fallen in the sugarcane fields. First Sergeant Daniel Mackenzie sat in a shallow foxhole, his face caked with a mixture of coral dust and dried sweat. He was cleaning the action of his Thompson submachine gun with a piece of an old undershirt. Around him, the remnants of his platoon were doing the same. There was no more joking about vacations in Hawaii or drinking beer at the airfield. The men moved with a heavy, deliberate slowness, the movements of soldiers who realized they were locked in a war of extermination. They had learned the first and most painful lesson of Saipan. Against an enemy who lived inside the earth, conventional infantry tactics were a death sentence. To move in columns was to die. To trust the silence was to die. If the Marines were to survive, let alone take the island, they had to stop being a traditional army and start being a demolition crew. The corkscrew and the blowtorch. The command structure, having realized the catastrophic failure of the initial intelligence reports, pivoted with the brutal efficiency that defined the Marine Corps. The new orders coming down from General Holland, Howlin' Mad Smith, were simple in theory, but grueling in execution. They called for a tactic that would later be immortalized as the corkscrew and the blowtorch. The corkscrew was the demolition charge, the satchel of C3 explosives thrown into the mouth of a cave or a spider hole to collapse the ceiling. The blowtorch was the M1A1 flamethrower, a terrifying weapon that projected a stream of liquid fire into the crevices where bullets could not reach. Mackenzie watched as the flamethrower teams, young men carrying 60-pound tanks of napalm on their backs, moved to the front. These men were the primary targets for every Japanese sniper on the ridge, yet they walked forward with a grim, suicidal courage. Beside them were the Zippo tanks, Shermans modified to shoot flames over 100 yards. The era of the clean island was over. The era of fire and brimstone had begun. Methodical destruction. The advance began not with a charge, but with a crawl. The Marines no longer looked for soldiers. They looked for anomalies in the landscape. A patch of grass that looked too green, a rock that seemed too symmetrical, a crack in the limestone that emitted the faint smell of tobacco or cooking rice. Mackenzie's platoon moved in small, 5-man fire teams. When a hidden pillbox opened fire, the Marines did not retreat. Instead, they hit the dirt and initiated a practiced ballet of destruction. One fire team would suppress the aperture with a constant stream of BAR, Browning automatic rifle, fire, pinning the Japanese gunners inside. Under this cover, a satchel man would crawl forward, dragging his belly over the sharp coral until he was close enough to heave 10 pounds of high explosives into the dark slit of the bunker. The results were visceral. A muffled thump would shake the ground, followed by a plume of gray dust and the sudden, jarring silence of a silenced gun. If the cave was too deep for a satchel charge, the flamethrower team moved in. The roar of the fire was like the breath of a dragon, sucking the oxygen out of the tunnels and turning the limestone tomb into an oven. It was a slow, agonizing process. They were measuring progress not in miles, but in yards. The integration of arms. The most significant adaptation was the seamless integration of support. The Marines had learned that they could not do this alone. Through the morning, the air was filled with the scream of F-6F Hellcats diving from the sky, dropping 1,000-pound bombs on the higher ridges to seal the deeper cave systems. Behind the front lines, the 75mm and 105mm howitzers kept up a rolling barrage. This was no longer a blind shelling of the coast. Forward observers were now perched on every available height, calling in precision strikes. Mackenzie marveled at the coordination. A radio operator would whisper a set of coordinates into his handset, and 2 minutes later, the very ridge that had been pinning them down would vanish in a spectacular fountain of orange flame and black smoke. Communication, which had failed so miserably during the initial ambush, was now the lifeblood of the division. Runners moved constantly between the shell holes, and new phone lines were laid over the bodies and the rubble. The Marines were weaving a web of steel and fire around the Japanese positions, slowly constricting the enemy's ability to move between their subterranean hives. The psychology of the hunter. The change wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. The Marines had stopped being victims of the trap. They had accepted that the island was a predator, and they had decided to become the apex predator. Mackenzie saw it in the eyes of his men, a dull, flickering light of predatory focus. They were no longer afraid of the ghosts in the earth. They were angry that the ghosts were making them work so hard to kill them. In the late afternoon, they encountered a massive limestone cave system that had held up the entire battalion for hours. It was a honeycomb of interlocking fire. Every time a tank moved forward, an anti-tank gun would slide out from a hidden recess, fire around, and vanish back into the mountain. Mackenzie didn't wait for orders. He coordinated a blind, suppressive fire from every machine gun in the company, creating a curtain of lead across the face of the cliff. Under this iron veil, he led a team of 3 flamethrowers to the flank. They climbed a nearly vertical cliff, their fingers bleeding as they gripped the jagged coral, and reached a vent at the top of the cave system. They didn't see the enemy. They didn't hear a command. They simply lowered the nozzles and unleashed hell. The internal pressure of the cave caused a backdraft that shook the mountain, and for a moment, The screams of the trapped defenders rose above the roar of the flames. It was a grim, horrific necessity. Control from the chaos. By the time the sun began to set on June 16th, the central plateau was a blackened, smoking wasteland. The sugarcane was gone, replaced by charred stalks and craters. But for the first time since the landing, the Marines held the high ground. They had cleared over 40 bunkers and 17 major cave systems in a single day. The cost had been staggering. The platoon was down to half its original strength. No chaos smenился контролем, but the chaos had been replaced by control. The Marines had adapted. They had looked into the abyss of the Japanese defense and decided to burn it out. As Mackenzie looked back toward the beach, he saw the endless line of supplies still coming in. The American war machine was a leviathan that could not be stopped, provided the men on the ground had the iron will to direct its fire. They were no longer walking into a trap, they were dismantling the trap, piece by piece, cave by cave. The island was still not clear, but it was being tamed. The Marines had learned how to fight in the dark, how to breathe in the smoke, and how to kill an enemy they could not see. The second day of Saipan had proven that while the Japanese could hide in the earth, the Americans owned the fire that could purge it. The end of the world. The campaign for Saipan did not end with a grand surrender or a formal signing of documents on a battleship. It ended in a jagged, wind-swept corner of the world where the land simply ran out. Marpy Point was the final stop on a 3-week journey through purgatory. Behind the Marines of the 2nd and 4th Divisions lay 25 miles of scorched earth, pulverized limestone, and the wreckage of 2 civilizations. Before them lay only the vast, indifferent blue of the Philippine Sea and the sheer, terrifying drops of the northern cliffs. First Sergeant Daniel Mackenzie stood on a limestone ridge overlooking the final pocket of Japanese resistance. He was a ghost of the man who had stepped off the Higgins boat less than a month ago. His uniform was a tattered collection of rags held together by grime and salt. His face was a map of exhaustion, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. He had lost 2/3 of his original platoon. The men who remained no longer looked like soldiers. They looked like survivors of a natural disaster that had lasted 24 days. The corkscrew and blowtorch had done its work. The Japanese 43rd Division had been compressed into a tiny sliver of land at the northern tip. They had no water, no medical supplies, and no hope of rescue. Yet, the expected white flags never appeared. Instead, the Marines witnessed something that would haunt the American psyche for generations. The final, desperate Gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel. The Night of the Damned. The final organized Japanese counterattack had occurred 2 nights prior, the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, some armed only with bayonets lashed to bamboo poles, and others with nothing but stones, had thrown themselves at the American lines in a suicidal frenzy. Mackenzie remembered the sound of it most of all, not the screaming, but the rhythmic, chanting roar that rose above the sound of the machine guns. It was the sound of an army choosing death over the perceived dishonor of capture. For hours, the barrels of the M1917 heavy machine guns had glowed cherry red as they mowed down wave after wave of charging men. When the sun rose, the fields were carpeted in khaki uniforms, a literal wall of bodies that the Marines had to climb over to continue their advance. But as they reached Marpy Point, the horror shifted from the military to the civilian. Thousands of Japanese settlers, told by their government that the American devils would torture and murder them, began to follow their soldiers into eternity. From his vantage point, Mackenzie watched through his binoculars as hundreds of people, mothers holding children, elderly men, young girls, leaped from the 1,000-foot cliffs into the churning surf below. The Marines stood on the edge of the abyss, shouting through megaphones, pleading with the civilians to stop, promising food and safety. But the propaganda of the Empire was stronger than the mercy of the Corps. The silence that followed each leap was more deafening than any artillery barrage. It was a tragedy of such scale that it stripped away the last vestiges of the easy victory myth. The mop-up of the grave. By the afternoon of July 9th, the organized fighting was over. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner declared the island secured. But secured was a relative term. The island was still a honeycomb of hidden dangers. Thousands of Japanese soldiers remained bypassed in the caves, refusing to acknowledge the end of the battle. Mackenzie's final task was the methodical clearing of the last few caves near the northern airfield. There was no more adrenaline, no more banzai charges. It was now a grim, bureaucratic process of elimination. The blowtorch teams moved from hole to hole, sealing the entrances with satchel charges. They no longer searched for intelligence, they searched for finality. The Marines moved through the ruins of Garapan, once a thriving town of 10,000 people, now reduced to a few standing walls of coral concrete. The sugar mills were twisted skeletons of rusted iron. The clear island that the headquarters had promised on June 15th had finally been achieved, but it was a clarity born of total destruction. The weight of the metal. In the late afternoon, as the smoke began to clear from the northern cliffs, a small ceremony was held near the ruins of a Japanese command bunker. Medals were prepared, citations were drafted, and promotions were handed out to fill the gaps left by the dead. Mackenzie sat on an empty ammunition crate, watching the replacement troops arrive. These were fresh-faced boys in clean uniforms, their gear still smelling of the factory. They looked at the veterans of the first wave with a mixture of awe and terror. They saw men who had been forged in a fire so hot that it had burned away their humanity, leaving only a hard, obsidian shell. A young lieutenant approached Mackenzie, asking where he should park the new water trailers. Mackenzie didn't answer immediately. He was looking at a small, scorched doll lying in the dust, a relic of the civilians who had lived here before the storm. He realized then that the victory on Saipan was not a triumph of ideology, but a triumph of logistics and sheer, stubborn endurance. They had taken the island because they had more fire, more steel, and more men than the Japanese could kill. But the cost had been the soul of the island itself. The clear island was now a vast, open-air cemetery. Over 3,000 Americans and nearly 30,000 Japanese lay in the soil. The silence that had returned to Saipan was not the peaceful silence of a forest. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. Reflections from the edge. As the sun began to set over the Philippine Sea, painting the water in hues of bruised purple and blood orange, Mackenzie walked back toward the beach where he had landed weeks ago. The Blue Beach sector was now a massive, bustling port. Piers had been built, roads had been paved, and the first B-29 superfortresses were already being prepped for the long-range bombing of Japan. Saipan had served its purpose. It was now a giant, unsinkable aircraft carrier, a stepping stone to the heart of the empire. The planners in Washington had been right. The island was the key to the war. But the men who had turned that key would never be the same. Mackenzie reached the shoreline and looked out at the fleet. The great battleships were still there, dark silhouettes against the twilight. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of volcanic rock he had picked up near the summit of Mount Tapochau. It was sharp, jagged, and cold. He thought about the clear island, the lie that had sent them into the trap. He thought about the laughter of a man like Leonard Funk, the courage that arises when the math of survival says you should already be dead. On Saipan, everyone's math had been wrong. The Japanese had underestimated the American will to burn them out, and the Americans had underestimated the Japanese will to die in the dark. The final silence. The guns were finally cold. The corkscrew and blowtorch were being packed away for the next island, the next trap, the next descent into the earth. Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. They all lay ahead, each a more horrific version of the lessons learned on Saipan. The silence of the stones was the only thing that remained. The wind whistling through the limestone caves no longer carried the scent of cordite, but the memory of it was etched into every grain of sand. The island was finally clear. There was nothing left to kill, nothing left to burn, and nothing left to say. Daniel Mackenzie threw the piece of volcanic rock into the surf and turned away from the sea. He began the long walk back to his tent, his boots crunching on the coral that had once been a fortress, now just a road leading home. The battle for Saipan was over, but the war for the world was just beginning its most violent chapter. As he walked, he didn't look back. There was nothing left to see but the shadows of the cliffs and the ghosts that would forever guard the clear island of Saipan.